Jay, a question for you. In late 2016, you agreed to become chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission after working for 20 years plus at a small law firm downtown, Sullivan and Cromwell. And you had no prior experience in government, but you probably knew more than any other prior SEC chair, except for Joe Kennedy, about how the Wall Street worked. And you accomplished a great deal when you were SEC chair, particularly in regulatory reform. What were some of your biggest accomplishments as chair of the SEC?
What I feel best about, Bob, is that we had good people and we were able to empower them. You can't accomplish a lot unless your people are accomplishing a lot. I was very lucky. There were a lot of openings at the SEC when I went in. Good people stepped up and said, "I'd like to serve," and then giving them the room to get things done is something I'm very proud of. And one other thing, I think, it's funny. You don't think about this in a quote unquote Republican administration, but we made a firm-wide, commission-wide commitment to inclusion and opportunity, and it became part of what we did every day, and I feel very good about that.
What was your biggest surprise when you got down to Washington and became the SEC chair?
Just how political the agency
Ambassador knows.
had become. And going back to, and it took me a little while to figure this out, but going back to empowering people, they can only be empowered if they are removed from that political toing and froing. So I took it as my job to take that as what I handled, try to give them the freedom to do what they thought was right. But it took, like, well, holy cow, really? Like, whatever I say, you're going to take the opposite side? That's a tough environment to get used to.
We had to go appear before Congress. That probably was not too easy.
Not too easy at first, to be relished it at the end. Look, it's your chance to make a point.
ESG, environment, sustainability, and governance is sort of the buzzword of the moment in the corporate boardrooms. Markus, do you think we're going too far in that direction?
Absolutely not. I mean, everyone talks about it. We need to change. I wouldn't say anything to disappoint my daughter, and she represents the young generation, the next generation. It's the Young Leaders Conference, so we have to go about it because the world is in trouble. We all know that. The question is how we do that. And I believe, the saying, no good deed goes unpunished, that people go into an exercise by claiming things that they don't really have a clue how they can achieve it. Certainly not without the necessary government intervention. And it would be the biggest insult and disappointment to the young generation if you were to make big promises without a real plan. And when I see we have a wonderful agency here sponsoring a table, so present company, of course, excluded, but there are some agencies that get big financial services company to claim to completely decarbonize the portfolio. And I do believe personally that, the demand is created thereby may outstrip the supply. And one has to be very careful to actually know what you're saying. And I thought you were going to bring a question, and I read a small little book, and the title of the book is Lying, and I'm going to give you a quote, because I think that's the biggest risk that we're doing. And it says, we often behave in ways that are guaranteed to make us unhappy. Many of us spend our lives marching with open eyes toward remorse, regret, guilt, and disappointment. And nowhere do our injuries seem more casually self-inflicted or the suffering we create more disproportionate to the needs of the moment than in the lies we tell other human beings. Now, I'm not saying people are lying with intention or with malice, but you really need to know, and I learned this as a lawyer, you need to know the meaning of words. you need to know what the promise contains, and you need to know the dependencies, and you need to know the assumptions that you're making. And we all know that to go net zero is virtually impossible without government intervention. And I think the financial services industry to the political world, of course, is not just economical, but also expedient to put the burden on the banks, because we're heavily regulated. You can get this almost anywhere in the world, which is not the case for polluters. And one has to be very careful that the good deeds that we're making here are honest, have a plan behind it, and I feel very proud to be part of it, what we're embarking to do at UBS. I think we all have a role to play, but none can play just on their own.
Jay, to what extent should government use the focus on ESG to promote policy objectives, and what are the risks that companies face in this environment?
So let me just say I agree with Markus. You have to be really careful of instant solutions to long-term difficult problems. And to promise somebody that by investing $1 in one place or another today, you're solving these issues that are very important and need to be addressed, that you're doing so is, a fool's errand. To your question, which I think is quite a good one, SEC, pick your agency, needs to stay within their jurisdiction. The SEC is not the EPA. Using the SEC to craft and implement environmental policy, not only is it unlawful, it's going to be unsuccessful. So I'm an ardent believer that if we're actually going to take this journey on, as Markus noted, it needs to be a whole of government approach.
Jay, you're now the chairman of Apollo, a small investing firm. To what extent should ESG be an investing consideration?
Well, don't take my past comments as saying it should be ignored. I do believe that we are going to go down this journey. There will be a transition in our economy. If the focal point is carbon neutrality, then as an investor, you have to think about what that means. And not only are you going to adjust your portfolio for that, you're going to look for opportunities that make that transition more efficient, faster, and the like. And so those are the types of things you should be thinking about from an E perspective. From an S perspective, different paradigm. Where are we going as a country in terms of some of our intractable problems, such as, early education, fairness and access, housing, and things like that. How do you respond to those issues as an investor? Also important. And just to round it out, G, do you have transparent and clear governance? But you'll notice that in each one of those things that I mentioned, the considerations are really different. And so I'm happy to lump them together for purposes of a discussion, but not for a purpose of analysis.
Another topic that's much in the news is cryptocurrency, and for the non-lawyers and bankers, that's the idea of having private digital currency. Now, yesterday, Jamie Dimon said that Bitcoin was worthless. John Paulson said the same thing a few weeks back. Markus, do you think that cryptocurrency is the currency of the future, or is it something that's going to end up being worthless?
The saying is never bet against the Fed or any central bank. So I think it will take a while. I think it's technology that we should all look at. We're obviously in the process of doing a lot of effort in the digital world. And for that, you need to have an innovative spirit, and that means to experiment. Now, of course, crypto has various aspects, whether it's the ledger technology, whether it's a payment means, or whether it's just investing. It will take a while, but we don't know whether that while is going to be accelerated or not. And of course, our clients have an interest in that. So we'd be fools not to be interested and curious what works. But I believe for crypto to become a fiat currency, it will take quite some time, because the Fed is not going to easily, give up their jurisdiction.
Jay, when you were at the SEC, you focused a lot on issues surrounding cryptocurrency. I mean, how should regulators address cryptocurrency?
Well, again, I'll start by agreeing with Markus that, vast technological change is coming. What particular products survive, we don't know. But in terms of regulating those products, and Mr. McIntosh there and I wrote an op-ed on this, take the function that those products are providing, look at the current analog. So if it's a stable coin, for payments, how do we regulate payments? If it's an ICO for raising money, how do we regulate securities? I think that's the touchstone for regulators for the beginning. Don't be led astray by labels. Just because you call it a token doesn't mean it's not a security.
Let me turn to the question of global regulation. We live in a time of increasing globalization, and the world is dominated increasingly by big multinational companies from Apple to UBS, and our regulatory systems were created in a different time. Now, Markus, as the General Counsel of UBS, you worked with global regulators from around the world, and Jay, as the head of the SEC, you work with many of the same folks. How can we improve our regulation of, let's just take financial institutions, particularly global financial institutions, Markus?
The experience I had, certainly in the LIBOR matter, was one that many of us shared, which was the phenomena of piling on, that any regulator in the world who had a threat of jurisdiction on a matter wanted to be part of the party. And that's not just very inefficient, it's also extremely expensive. And when you look at regulation, it should have a cure. It should have a remedial aspect to it. It should just not be that you were at the party having discussion. And of course, as globalization is no longer, the trend of the week, the question is whether regulation can focus where the center of the action was and let other people have a pass. But many of the agencies have become too powerful. And many of the law firms have become too powerful, and they settle, not just in the United States, but outside. Class action regimes are coming in, and of course, the regulatory issue is just one. It's a precursor to the civil actions that come afterwards. But if you were to dream of a really effective world, the piling on phenomenon needs to go away. I don't think it will, certainly not during my lifetime as a general counsel, because it's just too attractive. And it's expected that when something blows up, that anyone who can will take action of it. But I believe the most effective way to bring change to a misbehavior is to address it there where most of the misbehavior happened, where the people who were involved feel the pressure, because most people, mostly, boards or executives, if it's far away, it's just a legal settlement. It doesn't really touch their reputation when they go grocery shopping the next morning. And I think the social aspect of remedy needs to be brought back where the action really happened. It's a difficult thing because regulators used to be very, very local. And then they organized themselves around the world, communicate with each other. They also found the fancy of media coverage, which made certain agencies very powerful. I remember the first dealings I had with the CFTC, and the CFTC at a certain period prior to your chairmanship at the SEC was an agency regulating grain in Chicago, but it surpassed the powers of the SEC, at least temporarily.
And now the chairman of the CFTC is the chairman of the SEC.
Exactly.
Jay, what do you think in response to Markus?
Look, I agree. I think it's very unfortunate, particularly on the enforcement side of regulation, if it becomes a competitive exercise. If you have enforcers competing against each other to see who can prove that they're the most rigorous or the most tough, that's an unfortunate dynamic because it goes against, what are we trying to do with enforcement? You're trying to remediate, you're trying to compensate the victims, you're trying to deter it happening again. But there's also a sense of overall fairness. What is happening to all those other constituencies? That gets lost when people get their competitive juices going.
Yeah, I've always been frustrated by the fact that regulators sometimes don't think about the shareholders or pension funds often, and the employees of regulated parties. Do you have a thought on that, Mark?
It's not the job of a regulator. A regulator is like, a surgeon or a lawyer. You have a problem, you go fix it. You look at the consequences, but I think, the holistic concern for all stakeholders belongs more to the management and to the boards of the companies to make sure that which you do doesn't have these consequences. I think regulators, as you said a moment ago, Jay, you need to stay within your jurisdiction. And if you become a political force, what I said before on ESG, it becomes oftentimes very expedient and quite economical to go outside your jurisdiction, and you lose sort of the honesty of the mandate you have as a regulator.
And the Markus's earlier point, if in an enforcement situation you're able to focus on the individuals who are culpable, those collateral consequences are much less. Where if you can't focus on them and you have to, fine the institution or put them in, a difficult competitive position, those collateral consequences are greater.
Let me turn to something near and dear to my heart, the U.S. legal litigation system. My children and wife are here. From 1998 to 2008, Markus, it's incredible. You've had such an incredible run, not general counsel of one big company, but two. You were the general counsel of Swiss Re, which I think is the number 1 or 2 biggest reinsurer in the world. And after 9/11, Larry Silverstein, who my wife and I actually ran into in an elevator today, was the owner of a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center. And he claimed that the insurers should pay $7 billion on a $3.5 billion policy. And Silverstein's theory was, well, each aircraft attack on the Trade Center was a separate incident. Now, it's not easy to bet billions of dollars in the U.S. roulette litigation system and betting that the system is going to do the right thing, especially over something as fraught as 9/11. But you had the courage of your convictions, and ultimately Swiss Re prevailed at a trial. What were some of the lessons that you learned from the World Trade Center litigation?
It's been a while that large corporations actually face the risks of trials. But I was deeply convinced after preparing. I'm not, a person with a hazardous mind. You look at it, look at every aspect. You do mock trials. You figure out what the issue is really all about. And of course, the terrible tragedy, when we memorized 20 years of it, of the attack on the World Trade Center, was incredibly emotional. And there's some people who felt that I was absolutely losing the marbles to dare, as a Swiss company, just a few years after the dormant account, the Holocaust gold scandal that affected the banks, not so much the insurance companies, to go and stand trial in the Southern District. But when you look at what it was all about, it was just the meaning of words in a non-finalized insurance policy and the definition of occurrence. That was all there was. There was no emotion in it. It was actually a fairly dull, highly analytical question of law and meaning of words. And, the principal aspect of being a lawyer is to defend the English language or whatever language you practice in and give the words a meaning. And, to separate that from what everyone in the room believed at the time, that it was foolish to go. Once you know what you're doing, once you know what the real question is, there's nothing foolish about it. And it turned out to be a trial, and as I do every time, I sat through the entire trial and I watched everything very carefully. There was nothing emotional. There was nothing, that ought that a Swiss company would go and look for his rights. And I think that's a virtue we have lost a little bit because of the convenience to go and arrange for settlements that may be quick wins, but in the end, we're not paying for that ourselves. It's the homeowner who takes out an insurance with a higher premium, and I just felt I owe it to the company, and I had the support of the board to go and test that. It was a bit nerve-wracking because we had a hung jury, and then over the weekend, I remember everyone all of a sudden wanted to settle it because they felt, what if? And I said, well, now I can tell you 3 words: stay the course. Because if you give up after having litigated something for a long time, you completely lose all credibility going forward. But I think, the litigation system is bad. There's some other countries, I won't name them, neighboring countries to Switzerland, but I won't name them, where
Germany?
Litigation, wrong.
No?
Litigation is also...
Oh, France, I forgot.
It's also difficult, but, sometimes you just have to try. Once you're convinced that you've looked at every aspect of it and you have the better side of the story, and again, it's not hazardous, you need to stay the course, and that requires a level of endurance.
Jay, when you were chairman of the SEC, you were one of the few chairmen that I can remember in my lifetime who actually thought about the costs of civil litigation system on the raising of capital in the U.S. I mean, do you think there's a way we can sort of reform our system, or that it needs some reform? Obviously, it's against our personal interests, but...
Yeah, look, when, our enforcement division actually returned more money to harmed investors than any enforcement division in history. That said, I made it pretty clear, and this is sort of the converse of Markus's point, that I didn't want to try cases or even settle a case where if we thought we took it to trial, we were going to lose. And I think it's just very important that if people are in the right, they feel that they're going to get a fair shake at trial, that they get a fair shake, and if they do, that the regulator doesn't bring those cases. Close cases, fine. Cases where people did things wrong, if somebody wants to, those should be settled.
Let me turn to the non-legal topic, which is American politics, and I thought the ambassador did a great job raising very important questions for all of us to think about. Markus, you obviously have very strong ties to the U.S. and have spent a lot of your life here. Jay, you did a fantastic job running the SEC in a very difficult political environment, and both of you sort of have a good perspective on our system. And I agree with the ambassador. I've never seen our country as divided as we are today, although I didn't live through the Civil War, which probably it's real division. But I do think that by contrast, Switzerland is a nirvana. And so, Markus, my question is, what can we Americans learn from the Swiss political system and improve our country?
You can get inspired by the small size of the Swiss government. We have about 300 mostly part-time politicians that run the government. They all go home more or less, outside of the meeting periods, and they're accountable in their villages and in their towns. It's a direct democracy where we vote about many things every sort of other months, but it's the no surprise we have these discussions at the bank as well. We look at the complexity, the number of committees, and with that accountability. And I think the highest value of a politician is to bring change, to make things happen, and be accountable for it as a person, as an individual in the room, having said certain things. And the larger the committee, the larger the party, the larger the decision-making body gets, it's very hard to remember who actually wrote the bill and who was behind it. So I personally like it's not always efficient, but exactly who was behind it. And with the dialect was referring to, we speak in all the different languages. Every politician speaks in the language in Parliament, the mother tongue that it has, and everyone else is expected to do it. And that's sort of a sign that it comes from your chest. It's not something that's you read off talking points. So it's government, if it becomes too large, it's a problem. But of course, we're a much smaller country. But I think it's also the spirit and the mindset. I think we don't all know each other, but you're very, very exposed in Switzerland. I think, in my experience in the United States, you can find cover if you're, with the right group around you.
Yeah. So, I think, look, I couldn't agree more. The first step in solving a problem is identifying the problem. And as the ambassador said, right now, in the middle, it's really costly and really lonely. So, we have to recognize that problem. And again, staying the course is difficult, but you need a critical mass of people who will stay the course to correct this.
I've often thought that one of the things that's hurt American politics was that, like in a state like New York, we actually had like a Republican senator. We had a Republican governor. In the South, they had, Democratic, for decades, Democratic politicians. And now we sort of have a political system that's a little bit divided along geographic lines. And I think that may be part of the issue.
Look, when you have no alternative in local, regional, state politics, you have to gravitate to the extremes. And we're having some of that, and it filters its way all the way up to what we see in Congress today.
A few more questions, and then maybe we'll open it up for some folks to ask some questions. Now, my daughter and my son are here, and Amelina's here. Both of you have been very, very successful. What advice would you give to a young person today in order to become successful in the world that we currently live in? And what are some of the keys to your success? Pay attention.
I read a book on Courtin. He was an educator, and among others, he educated Prince Philip because he was founding a school in Germany and had to flee from the Nazis and went to found Gordonson. And he said, there are 5 values I would like to instill in my students. And when I read it, I was very touched by it because I feel, that's the values that I live. The first one is keep the curiosity at the level of an adventurer. The second one, keep the sharpest mind. Now, of course, you need to first earn the sharpest mind, and you can only do that if you're ready to play chess against someone who is sharper than you are. So stay very, very sharp by exposing yourself. The third one is being very hard with yourself in fulfilling your goals or delivering the goods or whatever you're doing. You just don't give up. And the fourth one, which I find the most difficult one when I observe many people around me, is don't take yourself too important. Don't ever put yourself in the middle of the room. And there's a very logical aspect to it, because if you're in the middle of the room, you have a spectrum of 12, 14%. You cannot read the room. You're too self-occupied. And when I did the Trade Center litigation, I had a media trainer, Lee Seidman, who was a 60 Minutes producer, and he said, when you speak to your opponent, you get, your facial muscles toughen up, and you don't bring the point across as well as you could. Try to be a cameraman at the corner of that room and watch yourself through the lens of the camera, because then you not only relax because you're not distracted by the unpleasant face of your opponent, but you can also read the room, and you know when to stop, you know when to accelerate, and I think that has a lot of wisdom in it. And of course, the final one is have compassion. Everyone matters, and I'm very, very glad to be engaged with my 2 daughters in debate about diversity and inclusion, Black Lives Matter, and all those topics that will change the world. If you can absorb opinions from all walks of life, we're going to be better. And if you're listening to it, there's no idiot ever in the room. There's just someone who doesn't feel fitting into the room, and then you need to ask yourself whether the rest of the room is not fitting. But that has guided me well. And then my father, when I was young, Robert's age, he says, you know what, you can behave, and I was quite rambunctious then. He said, you can behave however you like, as long as you know how to behave. And to know your boundaries and to have that freedom. And I think it's adding on to what Ambassador Pitloud said. We're living in a world where you can barely voice what you really think. Young students, you don't have to go into the canceling culture and what politicians sometimes say. It's mind-numbingly boring because it misses the edges. So to know, what is tolerated, but be really, really free and be a rebel within that helps you a great deal.
Shay, your perspective.
I would just emphasize two things that Markus said. Stay curious. Some of the ambassadors said, don't be afraid to take a risk. And then if you have the privilege of being on a great team, relish it. Try to learn how to build it, because teams can accomplish a lot more than individuals. So I think those are things to think about.
That was great.